right, so this is the first of the 3 spots. Now, this is an area that I had hunted before, probably, well, I've hunted now for about 2 years now. And basically, I hunted further north up here in some of this thicker cover. There's an old, clear cut there, and then some pines, and then basically some overgrown, undergrowth or understory, a bunch of popple, and miscellaneous mature trees as well. So basically what I did was basically on my way out one time, just started scouting my way out and came across further south, there's a little bit of an opening that had some, basically it had been logged long ago, and it's got some more mature oaks growing in, as well as a bunch of, understory, basically ferns that are growing in here. And I noticed that part of my walk in and out is that there were several spots of where it looked like there had been bedding and a lot of trails basically moving from east to west here on the property. So basically I started scouting this area, again starting out with the mapping area, and just started mapping out different trails that were, a lot of them were moving from north to south, but then also there were several that were running from east to west as well. So pulled up the mapping area, and again, one of the first things I like to do is kind of look at the terrain. So right off the get-go, you can see that there's a bunch of thick timber on either sides of the property, and then essentially through this area is intermittent, mature trees, as well as again the ferns. Now with that alone, it's not too doesn't really stand out all much, other than the fact that there is that significant amount of cover to the west, and now that area is actually fenced off to where I can't actually hunt that area. So again, it's one of those things that kind of stands out as a potential sanctuary area where deer are going to feel comfortable in there because they know they're not going to get much pressure in there. So it comes down to starting to break down where the deer are going to come from, or where they're going to be going, and basically in part of my boots on the ground scouting, I did find a patch of basically a patch of white oaks that were, a vast majority of them were developing or dropping acorns. So right in this patch here, there's a significant patch of the white oaks. Again, a lot of them were dropping mass amounts of acorns. And then all basically to the more or less the north, there's a bunch of immature oak trees that definitely showed a bunch of browse where you could see that deer were coming in here. So the other thing I'm looking at is when a lot of times when it comes to the terrain, so we basically show that there's a patch of kind of an old clear cut and a food source. There's no significant water anywhere in this area, other than there are some retention ponds further north, but water is an issue in this location. So the next thing I look at quite often is looking at the contour lines, or seeing where there's elevation differences. And they are somewhat hard to see here, but there is basically a funnel where there's high ground on either side of this area, and then there's a little bit of a valley through the central part of this area where the deer kind of funnel up into where these white oaks are. So during the course of running trail cameras on this oak little patch here, did have significant number of deer that were in here. A lot of does and fawns that were going in there, and then also the bucks started showing up again that mid-October time frame, especially when some of those acorns were really starting to get cleaned up a little bit from the deer that were coming in here. So I came across this spot late in the season, or not late in the season, but I guess about mid-October. So I kind of caught that peak of probably when those acorns were dropping, but there was still enough of them still falling that I was able to at least capitalize on some of that deer movement still. So I set up a camera and set up a mock scrape in the patch of those oaks to try to at least kind of focal any potential buck movement that were coming in that area, kind of meandering around in those oaks flats. So I showed that there's significant deer movement because of the the good food source with the white oaks. The next spot was confirming with the trail camera to confirm the type of deer movement that was there, as well as what type of deer were showing up. Basically, what I ended up doing was isolating this area a little bit, created that mock scrape, as well as the camera, and then looked at areas of opportunity for tree stand locations. So I started out essentially directly south of that patch. So it was basically 20 yards into that patch I could shoot. The issue is that it was very limited on the ability to essentially get multiple shot opportunities. There's another spot off to the west or off to the east that is just again just to the east of the oak flat. This is an area where a lot of those immature oak saplings are growing in, and where there's a lot of browse. Where it seemed like, based on the camera intel, that a lot of the bucks were moving more so from the east to west direction, and more of the does were traveling to north and south. So a lot of those bucks were coming in from the adjacent property. Now to the east there, I don't know exactly where those bucks are exactly living or coming from. There's a lot of private property off to the east there, and I don't have access to it, so I don't know how far away those bucks actually are, or basically they're that location that's where they actually are bedding. So I suspect they're bedding mostly to the east, but they could also be here on the west side within that area that is going to be much more secluded and have very little, if zero, human interference. And then the last spot I picked was further north. So again, this is more, it's probably about 40 to 60 yards away from that oak flat. And it's basically, again, trying to catch these deer before they make it to that oak flat, as well as take advantage of a potentially different wind direction. So, the two tree stands I have to the south are for more, again, a north wind or wind coming out of the north. Now this, again, could be isolated to, or could be as wide a range of any wind out of the north could be hunted out of these two locations. To the north, as you would suspect, for anything with a south wind. Now, ideally, it's either directly south wind or wind coming out of the south. Don't always remember exactly when you say south wind if it means coming out of the south or going south. But anything coming out of the south. And then also to have, kind of it coming out of the west. So southwest wind as my avenue of approach is basically walking along the property line along the northeast side to where I can park. So this area has a nice food source available. You have terrain that funnels the deer movement. Access isn't all that difficult. As to the south, about 100 yards out, there's a main highway that you can park along. And then from the north, it is a bit of a farther walk, but you can basically walk into this area with relatively low impact, especially because this is a long, narrow property. And again, I don't suspect that a lot of the deer are bedding within that area. Most of them are bedded on adjacent properties. So this makes it ideal for being able to come in here and, not really, be stuck in a stand, with deer, either bedded right on top of you where you can't get down, or where they're feeding and they're not going to move out of the area as well. The downfall with it, again, with it being a narrow property, that, you're either going to see the deer or you're not really, I guess I should say. I mean, it's one of those areas where you have limited access. So if, those bucks that do frequent this area, you're only going to catch up with them in that small window that they're in, on this property. It's very difficult to expand and learn further or be able to, cut the distance on where those deer might be coming from because of the property lines. But this is just one area that, again, started out hunting further north, and then is gradually just kind of relearning an area and finding a focal point of deer movement, and utilizing some in-season scouting from years past to find a pretty hot spot in regards to the time of the year with those acorns dropping and some of the pre-rut coming in, getting those bucks up on their feet more. and venturing out more than their typical, feed the bed pattern. Now, so far in this year, I've run a camera and scouted those oak trees from that patch. They are producing some acorns, but certainly not as much as last year. So there is a potential that they're not going to have it's not going to be as hot of a spot this year as it was last year, in regards to just the fact that the food source is going to be a little bit more limited than what it was last year. But again, it's going to be I'm still trying to learn a little bit about this spot, because of the fact that it's I didn't really discover this spot until about mid-October last year anyway. So more to come will be for this spot on if it's still going to hold the same type of deer movement patterns or bucks that showed up last year. But it's definitely one of those spots where, again, it's a very small area, very easily overlooked. A lot of the hunters that hunt in this particular area hunt much further to the north, where there's a far bigger area to kind of look at and basically hunt. A lot of this further to the north, there are some good areas along the edges as well, but to the vast majority of the middle, it's either clear cut open field or basically a very, 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 very thick patch of popples that you could hunt the edges, but the idea of trying to get in there to be able to hunt those locations, it'd be very difficult to be able to get in and out without essentially making a ton of noise and spooking a lot of deer. The problem is too, is with it being so thick in there, that the potential for deer movement being kind of sporadic within there is pretty high too. So it'd be really hard to pinpoint exactly where those deer are coming from in that area. The only other spot that I have of interest for this spot is to the southern part of the edge. I'm on kind of part of the L shape of the property. There's a patch of pines here that are running on the south side of this clear cut, as well as that really thick patch of popples. There again is a little tiny valley from the contour lines. It's basically a little bit lower than the where the popples are, and it filters down into a lower area down where the pines are. And through this little area where there's a tiny bit of patch of clear cut as well, there are some areas where there are clearly some rub lines that have been historic, where there's rubs from past years as well. Again, the hard part is really getting in there, and then you have basically kind of limited access to be able to hunt this in different winds, because you basically have to have a wind out of the north at all times. And then even at that, with that patch of pines, it's all mature red pine. There's no significant cover in there, so you really have to be reliant on the deer travel. I suspect mostly during the pre-rut and rut, you might be able to capitalize on this, but outside of that, those historic rubs, you don't know if they're utilizing that during the daytime. There's nothing really other than that significant cover to the north that would suggest why these deer have to go through here or be here on a routine basis. So again, an area that I've kind of highlighted, but not an area where I've focused a ton of my attention to, based on the available the access routes aren't the easiest getting in and out of there, as well as it doesn't have the kind of multi-tier kind of breakdown of the spot where there's multiple things going for it at once. This kind of has this one or two things that aren't really all that convincing in regards to a good spot or not. So I guess that's one thing that I guess I kind of neglected to cover before even jumping in these spots. Typically what I'm looking at is, especially when I pull up a map, is where if I'm looking for contrast. So if it's a very thick patch of woods, is there an opening, or is there a bunch of is there a water source nearby, like a pond or a clear river or creek or something that stands out essentially. So anything that really catches my eye right off the get-go. And then more often than not, the next thing I'm looking at is those contour lines. So I'm looking at the terrain as to elevation differences. Are we looking at Are there significant hills? Are there valleys? Are there bowls? Are there low points? Are there ridges? Are there plateaus or benches? Those are, areas of, not necessarily like saying that one terrain feature is better than the other, but I'm looking for that terrain, or again that contrast in the terrain that would either funnel or attract deer movement. And then, of course, looking at those water sources, at those food sources, if you don't have anything that really stands out, so if there's not like an open field, or something like a food plot, or egg field or something like that nearby, looking for that other type of feed, whether it's acorns, soft mass, so apple trees. If you're looking at woody browse, so if you're looking for areas that have a lot of new cessation or new growth from an old clear cut or something along that line, looking for those areas where there's clearly been deer, browsing on the woody browse or feeding in those areas. And then the other thing I'm really usually looking at when it comes to the public land areas is I try to, if it looks like an area that's kind of like a no-brainer, or one that, very easily stands out, don't be surprised when you put your boots on the ground that someone else has found that spot as well. So I try to look for areas that are maybe off kind of the beaten path, maybe not the best spot to focus on, but something that has a lot of the same features, a lot of the same, again, those components that you would still look for on those, tier 1 locations that you can find on a tier 2 spot that may not have, may not be as as good of a spot, but it's still pretty darn good in regards to still having a lot of the features that deer are going to look for. Thanks for watching this segment from the Am I Hunting podcast. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you share the show with your friends. If you do want to see more, you can tune into the full episode right here on the podcast playlist. And if you're on the go, you can always listen to the podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And I hope to see you on the next one.